Story 1. The narrator, 18 years of age, resides in a quaint, village-like town in British Columbia. It is one of those places so minuscule that even residents in neighboring communities may not have heard of it. Her boyfriend lives in the adjacent town, which is similarly small and exceptionally quiet. Nothing of major consequence ever transpires in either location. The most significant scandals typically involve a bored teenager defacing a car or a bicycle theft. In any case, the drive between their residences spanned approximately 25 minutes. One recent night, her drive home was genuinely terrifying. She departed his home sometime between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the morning. Despite it being late spring, the air was chilly, a common characteristic for that region of Canada. As she was exiting his neighborhood onto the main road, she discerned two small boys running along the sidewalk. They could not have been older than 7 and 5, both dressed in pajamas, barefoot, and conspicuously without adult supervision. Initially, she surmised they might have secretly left their home for amusement, as they were climbing on benches and laughing as if engaged in play. However, the older boy then caught her gaze. He abruptly ceased his activity and looked directly at her. The narrator swore there was an element in that gaze that caused her entire body to turn cold, not in a conventional fearful manner, but rather with a profound sense of unease. It was as if he was advising her to continue driving. Ordinarily, she would have stopped to check on children so young, out alone at such a late hour. Yet, the overall atmosphere felt entirely wrong, as though she were the interloper. Consequently, she did not linger. She pulled out and proceeded toward the highway. It was then that she became aware of a vehicle behind her. At first, its presence seemed unremarkable. After all, it was a highway, where cars naturally appear and disappear. However, after a short while, she realized that no other vehicles had been present until this one emerged, and she had not passed any turnoffs or exits. Then, just as suddenly, it vanished. Its headlights were visible one moment and gone the next, with no indication of swerving or decelerating, simply gone. Her initial thought was that perhaps they had deliberately extinguished their lights, which was sufficiently strange on its own, but given her already heightened state of unease from the encounter with the children, it made her even more anxious. She continued her drive, and upon reaching a lit intersection, she half expected the car to reappear behind her, but it never did, not once. This intensified her nervousness, and at that point, her sole desire was to arrive home. Eventually, she exited the highway and turned onto the road that led to her small village. This road was narrow, completely devoid of street lights, and replete with twists and turns, flanked on either side by nothing but trees and dense brush. It was practically impossible to discern what was approaching around a corner until one was directly upon it. As she rounded one of these bends, her headlights illuminated two individuals walking, one male and one female. She did not recognize them, which immediately stood out to her because she genuinely knew almost everyone who resided in the area. The male appeared slightly older than herself, perhaps around 20, while the female seemed younger, approximately 16. The male carried a backpack and had longer hair, and their manner of walking along that road at 2 a.m. was distinctly abnormal. No one typically walked that particular road at night. It was not a place one ended up accidentally. As she slowly drove past them, maintaining a speed of approximately 30 miles per hour, the male abruptly began running alongside her car. This was not a playful jog intended to startle her. He maintained pace and stared directly into her window with an expression of intense seriousness. There was no smirk, no laughter, just a chillingly solemn look that made her skin crawl. She accelerated, but realizing she was approaching a stop sign, she had to decelerate again. She checked her mirror, and he was still in pursuit. She then took the turn into town, disregarding the speed limit entirely, driving at least double the posted limit. She observed no one following her thereafter, but she did not permit herself to relax until she pulled into her driveway. Even then, she felt reluctant to exit her car. Her heart was pounding, and she kept envisioning him emerging from the shadows. Unable to simply remain seated, she abruptly exited the vehicle and sprinted for the door. Just as she was in the process of unlocking it, she heard a loud crash behind her, sounding like metal striking pavement. She whirled around and saw a garbage can tumbling down the street, despite the wind not being strong enough to account for its movement. That was her breaking point. She darted inside, slammed the door shut, and quickly secured the lock. Fortunately, nothing further occurred that night, but the entire series of events left her profoundly shaken. She remains unsure of the true nature of the children, the vanishing car, or the man who pursued her. However, after that night, her perception of her quiet little town was permanently altered. Story 2. This particular incident occurred when the narrator was 19 years old, during a phase of her life characterized by a feeling of invincibility, as though nothing in the world could harm her. Her cousin had offered her a position assisting with their uncle's family-owned glazing enterprise, a type of business that specialized in installing expansive glass panes on towering structures. The job was situated in Destin, Florida, necessitating a temporary departure from her hometown in Tampa. Prior to heading there, she decided to make a detour to Russellville, Alabama, to spend time with family and then accompany her cousin to Destin. This journey marked her initial genuine solo road trip, and she readily acknowledged her profound lack of preparation. She was driving a faded green Mercury Sable, a vehicle that, in her candid assessment, was scarcely suited for anything beyond local errands. However, this did not perturb her. She was fueled by that youthful, invincible confidence, dismissing potential dangers with the thought, "What's the worst that could happen?" Her parents, predictably, had cautioned her repeatedly, urging her to pack food, water, and emergency provisions, typical parental concerns. Yet, she disregarded their advice, reasoning that she possessed a cell phone, fast food establishments were ubiquitous, and the drive was only a few hours long, not a desert crossing. Thus, she embarked on her journey feeling both eager and utterly naive. What she failed to anticipate was the potential for Alabama to become exceptionally cold, and to her surprise, her car's heater was non-functional. She had been unaware of its broken state, being a native Floridian. Nevertheless, she initially thought the chill was beneficial for maintaining her alertness, as she was exhausted from numerous prior stops. Eventually, she exited the interstate highway and commenced navigating a series of perplexingly numbered rural roads that lacked conventional names. The global positioning system, GPS, technology of that era was rudimentary. She was relying on printed directions from MapQuest, which essentially meant that a single incorrect turn would leave her stranded in an isolated, remote area with no means of reorientation. By this point, She was ravenous and found herself regretting her decision to disregard her parents' advice about packing snacks. She was unwilling to risk becoming further lost by deviating extensively from her planned route in search of food. Consequently, she silently wished for some establishment to appear alongside the road. True to her wish, she soon observed a dilapidated little country store, identifiable by a flickering light above a sign that simply bore the faded word "grocery." It appeared, to be frank, rather dubious. Most of the interior lights were unlit, yet the establishment did not seem entirely closed. She resolved to try her fortune, speculating that it might be one of those traditional, old-fashioned places that remained open late. She parked her vehicle and proceeded toward the front entrance. As her hand extended toward the door handle, she was convinced she caught sight of a silhouette moving inside, resembling a shadow at the far end of one of the aisles. The door was unlocked, which caught her by surprise. She pushed it open and announced, "Hello." No reply was given. She called out again, uttering something akin to, "Hey, I noticed someone inside. I was hoping to quickly grab a snack." Still, there was no response. The store also emitted a peculiar odor, reminiscent of meat that had been left exposed for an excessive duration. However, her hunger was paramount. Thus, she ventured further inside, attempting to discern if anyone would emerge. Then, unexpectedly, a man materialized from the rear of the store. He was not the elderly individual she had half expected, but rather a man seemingly in his early 30s. He sported a broad, polite smile fixed upon his countenance. The most unsettling detail, however, was that his eyes did not align with his smile. He simply stared at her without blinking, his face rigid, save for that persistent smile. The narrator distinctly recalled thinking that it was as if someone were wearing a human mask. The entire situation felt fundamentally wrong. He spoke, saying something to the effect of, "Oh, hey, sorry. We were just about to close. What can I get you?" She informed him that she had been driving from Florida and was merely seeking some snacks, perhaps chips and a soda. He nodded, confirming their ample supply, then proceeded to lock the front door behind her. He explained that this was to prevent others from entering while he assisted her. This action caused a slight unease in her stomach, but she was reluctant to appear impolite. He then instructed her to follow me and began to walk toward the back of the store, past various shelves, toward the plastic strip curtains commonly found in warehouses or meat processing areas. As he pulled one curtain aside, he surveyed his surroundings, glancing over both shoulders as if checking for observers. At this juncture, the narrator began experiencing a strong sensation of "nope" vibes. She then glanced to the side and noticed a display of chips she had not previously seen. She informed him, "Actually, I'll just grab one of these if that's cool." He did not appear pleased by her choice. He attempted to persuade her that the superior items were located in the back and that she should inspect them. Meanwhile, she observed buzzing flies circling above a meat cooler, and the packaged contents looked as though they had been sitting there for an inordinately long time. This was the decisive moment for her. She feigned checking her pockets and declared, "Oh man, I think I left my wallet in the car. I'll be right back." She spun around and hurried toward the front. The instant she reached the door, she twisted the lock with a frantic urgency, as though her very existence depended on it. When she finally wrenched the door open and turned to look back, the man had vanished. She did not pause to ascertain his whereabouts. She leaped into her car, accelerated rapidly out of the parking lot, and did not cease driving until she arrived safely in her cousin's driveway. Story 3. This event occurred a few years ago, and its impact remains with the narrator to this day. She distinctly remembered the date as June 28th. A group of them had attended the movies, a routine activity for them. Following the film, they meandered through the plaza for a period. This area featured numerous restaurants and shops, all brightly illuminated on the main facade where people congregated. However, the rear side presented an entirely different scene. It housed a mail distribution center, several dumpsters, and was notably deficient in lighting. It was undeniably not a location one would wish to linger in after dark. The city where the narrator grew up was characterized by a peculiar demographic blend. It encompassed upper-middle-class families, predominantly quiet, suburban types, yet a mere few minutes in any direction would transport one into a completely disparate environment. Exclusive country clubs coexisted with more impoverished neighborhoods. It was not uncommon to observe elderly individuals out and about, or the occasional questionable figure loitering. One learned to maintain a heightened sense of vigilance, yet at times, even that proved insufficient. On that particular night, the narrator was clad in a short summer dress, a garment entirely appropriate for the prevailing weather. After the movie, she was waiting alone for her ride, a situation she had experienced countless times before without ever feeling endangered. She passed by an individual who appeared visibly incapacitated, perhaps under the influence of a substance. She gave it little thought and continued walking, performing slow circuits around the plaza. Eventually, she circled back near the mail distribution center, and once more observed the same individual, who was now standing upright as if awaiting someone. She assumed he might solicit money or a lighter and attempted to avoid him, but he stepped directly into her path and grasped her shoulder. She immediately tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip on her arm. It was then that she perceived he possessed a weapon. In that precise moment, her entire being froze in terror. She was utterly petrified and unable to even utter a sound. He instructed her to walk with him, and with the weapon directed at her, she felt she had no alternative. He guided her toward the rear of the plaza, near the dumpsters, where the darkness was almost absolute. The narrator honestly believed that her life was over. She was convinced she would not escape that situation. What transpired in that alleyway constituted the most traumatic experience of her life. She refrained from detailing the specifics, but confirmed she sustained both physical and emotional harm in a manner that irrevocably altered her. When the ordeal concluded, he simply departed into the night as though nothing had transpired, leaving her abandoned in the darkness. Her phone began to ring. It was her father, waiting for her in front of the theater. Somehow, she managed to rise and walk back to the car, functioning as if on autopilot. She remained silent for the entirety of the journey home, and her father likely attributed her quietness to moodiness. During that week, she scarcely left her room, abstaining from food, showering, and communicating with anyone. She felt shattered in a way she could not articulate, and consequently, she kept the experience to herself. However, The aspect that continues to affect her most profoundly is that months later, she saw the same man's image in the newspaper. He had been apprehended and sentenced for a transgression even more severe than what she had endured. And while a part of her experienced relief, another part felt profoundly deprived. He had taken something from her that she would never recover, and justice, even when served, cannot erase that loss. It required considerable time, but she eventually regained her voice. She confided in a select few individuals whom she trusted. She healed gradually, on her own terms, and has since progressed, not forgetting the incident, but steadfastly refusing to allow it to define who she is presently. Story 4. The narrator resides in one of those diminutive towns where notable events rarely occur. It is the sort of place characterized by tranquil streets, a significant population of older residents, and families strolling with their dogs. The most dramatic occurrence one might typically hear about is an attempted robbery at a fuel and convenience station, and even such incidents are infrequent, given that both stations are essentially adjacent to the local police department. Growing up, the narrator consistently maintained a cautious demeanor. This was partly attributable to her mother's highly protective nature and partly due to her own diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. This condition occasionally leads to hallucinations, rendering it challenging at times to distinguish between reality and illusion. However, regarding the events of one particular night, the narrator is unequivocally certain that they truly transpired. The incident commenced around 8 p.m. when the narrator and her friend decided to spend time together. They pooled approximately $25 and intended to visit the local food market for snacks. However, upon nearing the establishment, they realized it had just closed. This was not a significant setback, so they turned around and opted to go to the fuel and convenience station instead. As they were walking near the courthouse, the narrator noticed a man seated off to the side, engrossed in his phone, positioned somewhat angled toward them. He appeared to be in his 20s. For a fleeting moment, they jokingly speculated that he was likely about to feature them on a social media platform, perhaps due to their distinct appearance. Her friend was dressed in punk attire, while the narrator wore flowing ham pants and a button-up shirt. They certainly did not blend in, and it was not uncommon in that area for younger individuals to engage in such playful teasing. They gave it little further thought and circled around the courthouse to bypass any potentially awkward encounters, then continued toward the fuel and convenience station. As they passed the original location where they had seen him, the narrator observed that he was still seated there, phone in hand. Again, nothing about his posture or actions immediately screamed danger, merely conveyed peculiar vibes. They acquired some snacks, and as they were departing and walking past a nearby communal wash facility, the narrator noticed something that caused her stomach to lurch. Inside the facility was a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the individual they had observed earlier. And just as they were about to pass the large front window, the narrator witnessed him pressing his phone flat against the glass, pointed precisely toward their walking path. That was the definitive moment for her. She seized her friend's arm and virtually propelled them in the opposite direction. She had no comprehension as to why this individual seemed so intently focused on them, but she was absolutely unwilling to remain and investigate. She power-walked them back to the fuel and convenience station, while her friend attempted to dismiss the situation as not serious. However, the narrator was not prepared to take any risks, particularly as they possessed no means of protection. The manager at the station suggested they report the incident to the police, an idea neither of them felt particularly enthusiastic about. Her friend harbored a profound fear of law enforcement, and the narrator herself was not their greatest admirer. Nevertheless, the man was now nonchalantly seated outside the communal wash facility, and the narrator was not going to abandon her friend or simply hope for the best. Consequently, they entered the station adjacent to the police department. After a brief wait, they provided their names and recounted the incident. It transpired that the police had already received a separate call concerning the same communal wash facility, and were en route there irrespective of their report. When the narrator described how the man had literally pressed his phone against the glass, as though filming or anticipating their passage, even the officers conceded that his behavior was exceedingly peculiar. They expressed gratitude for the narrator and her friend for coming forward rather than simply disregarding the incident. Afterward, they remained near the station to compose themselves while the officers proceeded to investigate. Eventually, the officers informed them it was safe to return home, but they nevertheless took an extended route back to maintain caution. The narrator works at the local food market and profoundly hopes she never encounters that individual again. Story 5. This unsettling event transpired a couple of years prior, in the late summer, likely around August. The narrator and her husband, known to everyone as Skier, had recently relocated their lives from the bustling, chaotic metropolis of Los Angeles to an exceedingly small community situated somewhere in Nevada. The narrator chose not to disclose the town's exact name, but noted that its population did not even reach 900 inhabitants. Their decision to move was made after the birth of their son, Julius, driven by the desire for a more tranquil pace of life, reduced living expenses, and the advantage of fresh air for raising a child. The sole aspect that disquieted the narrator about their new residence was the considerable distance between homes. Their closest neighbor resided over a mile away, implying that in an emergency, she would essentially be isolated. Skier, however, remained unconcerned by this, as he consistently appreciated his personal space and the quietude. On a particular warm Friday evening, around 11 p.m., Skier was engaged in a late security shift at a regional credit union. Their baby, Julius, merely a few weeks old, was in a particularly colicky phase where no effort seemed to soothe him. He had been crying incessantly, and the narrator's attempts to calm him were proving ineffective. Recalling that car rides typically had a calming effect on the infant, she theorized that a walk might also offer relief, despite Skier having taken the family vehicle. They owned 2 dogs, Titus, a sizable German shepherd of immense loyalty, and Dasha, a small, fluffy Maltese who perceived herself as twice her actual size. Both dogs exhibited an extreme level of protectiveness, particularly concerning the narrator and the baby. Consequently, even though the outdoor environment was cloaked in pitch darkness in the middle of nowhere, the narrator felt sufficiently secure to venture out with them. She secured Julius to her chest, fastened the dog's leashes, and ensured she had her phone and keys before proceeding onto the dirt path located behind their house. This path, a winding dirt trail that snaked through a patch of trees, typically required about 10 minutes to traverse. The narrator harbored no significant concerns, as her upbringing near Topanga Canyon and frequent camping excursions had instilled in her a comfort with nocturnal natural environments. As anticipated, within a few minutes of commencing their walk, Julius finally settled down, and the dogs also began to relax. The narrator believed they were out of harm's way. However, just as they were approaching a line of fir trees visible in the distance, both dogs abruptly froze. Their bodies became rigid, and their gaze was fixed upon the tall grass to the right of the path. The narrator attempted to gently urge them forward, assuming the disturbance might be a rabbit or a similar small creature, but Dasha's fur bristled, and Titus emitted a low growl from his throat. This was particularly alarming, as Titus was typically the more composed of the two, and his growl caused the narrator's stomach to drop. At that juncture, she was completely unnerved. She had no inkling of what might be concealed in the darkness, and with an infant strapped to her and no means of self-defense, she was resolute in not lingering to investigate. She turned and began to retrace their steps, aiming simply to reach home. Inevitably, this was when the situation deteriorated. They had been walking back for less than 2 minutes when someone or something materialized on the trail directly in front of them. The narrator unequivocally stated that she had never experienced such intense fear before. The figure was diminutive, shorter than herself, perhaps comparable to the height of a child. However, the most disquieting element was the mask. The entity wore a ghastly pig mask, adorned with a crooked, carved-up smile and what appeared to be dried matter smeared upon it. The narrator could not ascertain if it was blood, mud, or paint, but it was horrifying. They stood there, silent, staring at each other, the narrator frozen in terror. Then, without warning, both dogs lunged forward, barking and snapping as if prepared to attack this individual. The narrator admitted her gratitude that the leashes held them back, as the situation was rapidly escalating. What truly terrified her, however, was the complete lack of reaction from the pig-masked individual. They merely looked down at the dogs as though observing squirrels. Then, they finally noticed the baby secured to the narrator's chest and emitted a peculiar, high-pitched wailing sound, akin to a cry, before turning and fleeing into the trees without uttering another word. The instant the figure vanished, the narrator wasted no time. She turned and ran. Despite having given birth only a few weeks prior, being in the dark, and having a baby strapped to her body, she managed to sprint home with the speed of an Olympic athlete. The walk that typically took 10 minutes was accomplished in approximately 3 minutes flat. She burst into her house, secured every door and window, and remained in the living room with the lights extinguished until Skier returned home. To this day, she remains without any explanation as to the identity of that person or entity. Nevertheless, she emphasized that if Titus and Dasha had not been present, she would not have detected the figure's presence until it was too late. Those two dogs were rewarded with copious treats and belly rubs for many months thereafter. The narrator also affirmed that she has not ventured outside alone at night since that incident and has no immediate plans to do so, regardless of whether a pig mask is involved, as she is unwilling to take any chances. Story 6. The narrator was raised in one of those small towns where nearly everyone knew each other, and residents traditionally left their doors unlocked without a second thought. Life simply felt more secure back then, or perhaps they were collectively more naive. When the narrator was approximately 14 years old, she had several regular babysitting assignments. One particular December night, one of the families she frequently assisted requested her to watch their 3 daughters while the mother attended a Christmas party. This arrangement was not unprecedented. The mother trusted her to stay late and had even informed her that if she did not return until after 3 a.m., it was acceptable, provided she had pre-booked a taxi. The girls were pleasant, and after some playtime and settling them into bed, the narrator went downstairs as the mother had suggested, since the upstairs television was broken. She recalled simply browsing through television channels for a couple of hours. It was likely around 1:30 in the morning when she picked up the cordless phone, possibly intending to call her mother or sister to inform them she would be home late. It was at that moment that she heard the front door upstairs creak open. This caught her off guard, as the mother typically entered quite quietly and would have immediately announced her presence if it were her. The narrator speculated that perhaps she had consumed too much alcohol, so she rose and began ascending the stairs. As she reached the top, she heard someone stumble, prompting her to quicken her pace, thinking the mother might have tripped. However, the instant she rounded the corner, her heart virtually froze. It was not the mother. 3 strangers stood in the entryway. A woman who was evidently inebriated, slumped halfway inside the doorway, and 2 men positioned behind her, who appeared as bewildered to see the narrator as she was to see them. The narrator inquired about their purpose, and the woman mumbled something about being there for a party. This explanation was clearly illogical, so the narrator then asked if they even knew the woman who resided there. When she uttered the homeowner's name, they seemed to have no familiarity with whom she was referring. One of the men scrutinized the narrator in a manner that made her feel deeply uncomfortable. He then inquired if she was there alone. The narrator was unwilling to answer that question. Her immediate concern was the 3 young girls sleeping upstairs, and she was absolutely resolute in preventing any harm from befalling them under her care. Instead of responding, she firmly informed them that there was no party at the residence and that they needed to depart. The intoxicated woman persisted in insisting they were at the correct address. It was then that the man who had asked about her being alone took a step toward her. At that precise moment, they all heard a beep, like a phone button being pressed. The narrator had completely forgotten she was still holding the cordless phone, but that subtle sound seemed to disconcert him. He must have presumed she had telephoned someone or dialed the police, because abruptly, he instructed the others that they were leaving. He seized the woman, directed his companion to assist, and they all somewhat awkwardly stumbled back outside. The moment the door closed, the narrator locked it with such rapidity that it likely rattled the doorframe. She hurried to the front window to observe their departure, initially thinking they might genuinely have mistakenly come to the wrong address. However, they did not halt, they simply continued walking down the block as if heading to a specific destination. It was then that the narrator realized they had not simply wandered into the incorrect house, they were definitively not supposed to be there. When the mother returned a couple of hours later, she was too inebriated to notice much. She expressed a slight surprise that the front door was locked, but the narrator simply stated that it made her feel more secure. She did not disclose the incident to the mother, not because she believed it was trivial, but because she felt somewhat foolish for not handling it differently or contacting law enforcement. She still often contemplates how much worse the situation could have become and remains grateful that it did not. Story 7. This narrative is one of those family stories that has been transmitted through generations, with everyone swearing to its veracity. The manner in which it has consistently been recounted sends chills down the narrator's spine each time. This event took place in a distant past, specifically predating the 1950s, in a minuscule town nestled deep within the Mexican countryside. It was characteristic of places where families possessed their own land, complete with chickens, crops, and all necessities. Each dwelling was spaced out, enjoying its own parcel of property. People utilized outhouses instead of indoor plumbing, and these structures were situated a considerable distance from the main house, approximately 20 to 40 meters away. Consequently, one had to traverse the darkness merely to use the facilities. One of the narrator's distant male relatives suddenly passed away without any prior indication or warning. No one had ever observed him being ill, not even experiencing a cough. Thus, his death came as a complete shock and deeply distressed everyone. The family did not delay. They buried him the following day in the backyard, a customary practice at that time. That very night, the narrator's mother's great-aunt, then a mere child, awoke with a need to use the bathroom. With the courage typical of a young child, she ventured outside alone toward the outhouse, necessitating her passage by the recently dug grave. As she drew nearer to it, she began to discern a muffled banging sound and someone screaming. It was not a shout indicative of a struggle, but rather a sound as though someone was pleading for assistance. It is important to remember that this occurred in a time and place where people were raised hearing legends such as La Llorona. Therefore, encountering such a sound in the darkness would naturally terrify anyone. Instinctively, she raced directly back into the house, trembling and weeping, and roused her parents. However, they presumed she was merely frightened by her imagination and instructed her to return to bed. She attempted to sleep but could not shake the feeling, particularly because the sounds persisted. It felt as though her mind was trying to convince her it was merely a dream, but her intuition insisted otherwise. A couple of hours later, she once again needed to use the bathroom but remained deeply frightened. Consequently, she awoke her older sibling and requested their accompaniment. The sibling agreed without hesitation, and both children proceeded together to the outhouse. While she was inside, both siblings distinctly heard the same cries, that identical, dreadful wailing sound, and neither of them paused. They simply ran at full speed directly back to the house. This time, when they awoke their parents, the parents believed them, primarily because the older sibling corroborated that it was not merely the younger child imagining things. Their father dressed, journeyed down the lane to his brother's residence, and woke him. The two men retrieved shovels and headed directly to the grave they had dug just hours before. They commenced digging slowly at first, then more frantically as the sound appeared to become clearer. When they finally reached the coffin and opened it, they were utterly horrified by what they witnessed. The body, which they had originally laid flat on its back, was now face down. And when they rolled him over, they nearly screamed. His face, neck, and arms were covered in deep scratches, as if he had been desperately clawing at the interior of the coffin in an attempt to escape. The wooden interior of the coffin was visibly shredded with claw marks and indentations, and it was undeniably evident that he had been very much alive when they interred him. The family speculates that he either suffered from a rare medical condition that caused his heart to slow sufficiently to mimic death, or perhaps he had been in a coma-like state and subsequently awakened underground. Regardless of the cause, he was definitively deceased by the time they reopened the coffin, most likely from suffocation or a heart attack induced by sheer panic. The narrator's family never discusses this topic casually. It remains one of those unsettling events that continues to haunt them.